This program is made possible in part by the National Endowment for the Arts, Maryland State Arts Council through the State of Maryland and the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Howard County Arts Council through a grant from Howard County government.
Hi, welcome to Writing Life. My name is Mary Kay Zaravleff, and I'm a novelist who today has the distinct privilege of talking to Laura Lippman. Laura Lippman grew up in Baltimore, and she spent her high school years right here in Columbia, Maryland. She was a reporter for the Baltimore Sun for 12 years, and she's written 15 novels, the most recent of which are Life Sentences and What the Dead Know. Welcome to the Writing Life.
Thank you for having me.
We're happy to have you. 10 of your novels feature Tess Monaghan, and it's always a joy to see her snoop her way around Baltimore. And I loved in the last novel I read that her boyfriend suggested the bumper sticker, WWTMD. What would Tess Monaghan do in this? I don't know if he had it on a bumper sticker. But her devoted fans and many new readers have come to your two latest books. And so my first question is, what is a Tess Monaghan book and what isn't?
A Tess Monaghan book is part of a series, and a series is by definition an open-ended work that characters need to move very incrementally. You can't use them up. You know, in a typical novel, a novel that is not part of a series, characters are done by the time you get to the end. Sometimes people do write sequels, but generally their entire stories have been told. So the Tess Monaghan series is very open-ended. And it's a worldview that is, I think, a little lighter than the worldview that one finds in the standalones. And that's because Tess Monaghan has a kind of rueful optimism about human possibility. Even though she has been shown again and again that people can be deceitful and unkind and even violent, she still believes generally that most human beings are okay. And that's not always the point of view that comes across in my standalones, not by design, but it's almost as if there was some other part of my psyche that needed to be expressed and explored. And it's a much darker place, and a place that's certainly much more pessimistic about people's ability to change and be kind to one another and do the right thing.
I noticed that What the Dead Know is a darker story. And one of the things that was so fascinating to me about that was how you put it together from so many different points of view.
It's funny, I think I've actually never given birth to a child, but I sometimes think that writing a novel is the same, in which you have to forget how hard it was or you'd never do it again. And I think, was What the Dead Know difficult to write? Did I struggle? And I must have, because I struggle every year. And matter of fact, right now is usually a time where I'm lost, I'm mired, I can't believe that I'm going to finish this book before the end of the year. And what I do is I go back and I look at last year's book in the draft where it was about this date. And it's always so much messier and so much more incoherent and so much more lost than I remember being. It sort of cheers me up that I've survived it before I shall survive it again. You know, in terms of structure, years ago at a conference, I heard the writer Dennis Lehane say something that really crystallized everything for me about what people who write crime novels do. He's talking about the film Chinatown. And I'll say right now, if there's anyone watching this who's never seen Chinatown and
Spoiler
wants to be
alert.
surprised, I'm about to give something away. Here it comes. Dennis Lehane said about the film Chinatown, it's a very simple story if you know that Evelyn Mulray slept with her father and had a child by him. And that really was, you know, the cliched light bulb moment. And I realized, yes, what we do is we tell simple stories and we get in the way of them. That we park all of this serpentine business that may or may not be related. We just make it very hard to get, and we hope enjoyably hard, interestingly hard. I mean, there's a moment in Life Sentences that's actually this really meta moment about the process of reading crime novels, because I came to writing crime novels through this very genuine love and affection for them. But as a reader, I like them best in the beginning.
Do you? Well, there's a moment in What the Dead Know where Nancy Porter is taking the suspect through the story, and the older investigator says she keeps taking her back through the same information until she's bursting to tell her story. And I wondered if you were mimicking how the reader feels, because we're revisiting the information and we're just ready to take the next step.
I think people who read crime novels are really bright, and they treat the text, most of them, interactively. And we think about interactivity as something that happens between a person and a computer. But a lot of readers are really interactive, and people who are reading mystery stories are definitely more likely to be interacting with the text. What does that mean? What does that mean? Is that important? Is that important? Mm-hmm. And at the beginning of the book, nothing is clear, and there's this wide, it's very funny. I came out of newspapers where the form is called the inverted pyramid, and the idea there is that you start with the most important information and you work down to the most trivial. But the shape of a mystery novel is a different kind of inverted pyramid, where you start with this world of possibilities, of answers. There are all these possible answers, and you keep eliminating one after another until you narrow down to the final answer. And I couldn't help noticing as a reader that is sometimes the least satisfying moment in a mystery, that the answer isn't the moment I tend to remember. I don't usually think about that, big confrontation moment where the searcher, the protagonist, comes face to face with the person who either has the information or is the killer and Life Sentences kind of takes that head on, because you have this character who is seeking information, and when she gets the answer, it's not satisfying. And I really wanted to play with that idea.
Will you read to us from Life Sentences?
Yes. I'll give it a little bit of setup. This is a character named Callie, and 20 years before this novel begins, Callie was suspected of killing her child because he disappeared. He was never found, but she also refused to ever speak of what happened. She invoked her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. So she was never charged with the crime of hurting her son or making her son disappear, but she was held in jail for 7 years on a contempt charge. They thought that would make her break, and it didn't. And this is the first time in Life Sentences that we see this character, Callie, who is at the center of so many people's imaginations. Stove hot, baby bad. Stove hot, baby bad. Stove bad, baby hot. Stove bad, baby cold. Stove baby hot cold. Stove baby hot cold. Stove baby hot cold. Cold stove, cold baby, hot baby, bad stove, bad baby, baby stove, baby stove, baby stove. She awoke, drenched in sweat. Supposedly part of the change, but she didn't think that was the whole explanation in her case. After all, she'd been having this dream for more than a decade now. Although it wasn't exactly a dream, because there was nothing to see, only words tumbling over each other, rattling like spare change in a dryer. But even if the non-dream dream caused tonight's bout of sweating, she knew menopause was coming for her. Up until a year ago, she'd really believed there would be time to have one more child, to grab the ring that had been denied her repeatedly, first with Renee, then Dante. She wanted so little. Sometimes she thought that was the problem. She had wanted too little. The less you asked for, the less you got. The girls who had the confidence to demand the moon got the moon and a couple of stars. They never cut their price. A man bought what they were selling or moved on. As soon as you began to bargain, the moment you revealed you were ready to take less than what you wanted, no, not wanted, but needed, required, they took everything from you. The flush had passed, but she couldn't get back to sleep. She changed into a dry nightgown, put on her robe, and went out to the glassed-in porch, which overlooked her neat backyard, her neighbors' yards beyond it. It was a house-proud street, not rich, but well-tended. Pretty little house, pretty little town, pretty little life. Bridgefield, Delaware. She would rather be in jail. She was in jail, actually, only this time there was nothing to sustain her. No hopes or dreams or promises. No, not jail. Hell. She was in hell, which was not, as it turned out, a place of fire and brimstone, of physical discomfort and torture. Hell was a pretty little house in a pretty little town, with plenty of food in the refrigerator and enough money in the bank. Not a lot, but enough, more than she had ever known. Her mind free from workaday worries, she had all the time in the world to dwell on what had gone wrong and could never be made right. What if she? What if he? What if they? Bridgeville, Hellaware. Most people would think it was a better fate than she deserved. They would be right.
Thank you. That's the first time we hear Callie's voice.
Yes,
and
that is the first time she appears in Life Sentences.
Cassandra has just begun to think, and there's even a good memory dream sequence where the TV's on and she hears things,
Yes.
and it stokes the memory of Callie, and now we hear Callie's voice. And that brings me to the question of what to tell and when. I mean, the corollary to that is who gets to tell it, but what to tell and when as you map these books out.
I begin a book, I know that central secret. You know, going back to the Chinatown story, I know this piece of information that I'm holding back. And I have to say, it's somewhat instinctual, but it's something also learned over the years. You know, I think back to writing my very first mystery novel, and in it, Tess Monaghan needs to find somebody. So she picked up the phone book and she looked them up, and there they were, and she called them, and I thought, gee, I don't know if that really works in a mystery novel.
Such suspense.
You know, clearly this is about creating obstacles. One of the things I have learned to use as a writer is the change in point of view. I wrote 7 novels in which essentially the only point of view was Tess Monaghan. Some of them had prologues seen from different people's points of view. The 7th book actually had a little bit from one character who kept coming in and out of the text. But generally, this is the way I wrote. And when I wrote a standalone for the first time, it was a book called Every Secret Thing. I began to see how you could, again, use the reader, get them all wrapped up and wound up in this character. What's going on with this character? What's happening? What did she just allude to? And then you just go to another character's point of view. And that creates pacing and suspense. You keep them sort of in this agitated dynamic where they want to be with the one they're with, and then it's like, okay, now I'm going to switch, and then we'll come back, and then we'll come back. And
it also plays with the truth. I mean, I've heard someone say there is no truth, there's only point of view.
Pretty close. I mean, there are things that can be established factually. When you really start to think about it, there are very few things that can be established factually. When you're having an argument with someone, you're completely reliant on memory. Everybody sees themselves at the center of the story. I mean, if anything, what I did as a reporter was unnatural, because as a reporter, you're off on the side trying to reconstruct a story in which you sometimes have point of view, but it's actually pretty rare as a reporter to be a first-hand observer to events. I mean, you might be in a Senate hearing room when a bill is being heard, but you're not there when the accident happens. You're not there when the fire catches. You weren't there when these events happened. But it's much more human to put yourself at the center of every story. And when you start looking at ways in which stories vary, it's not surprising what's ever surprising is that anyone ever agrees on anything. You know,
it seems like you're making this quilt of the truth from all these points of view. And memory, I mean, talk to us of memory. All the stories vary, all the memories vary.
Well, I'm fascinated by memory. Life Sentences grew from a lot of different things. It had, I call it a ball of string book, where over many years I had all these little things that interested me, and it's almost as if I had a mental file, and like it just go there, go there, go there, and eventually you'll come back to it. But sort of the seminal piece of string was listening to my husband tell this story about how much he loved the Washington Senators when he was a kid. And he loved them so much he would smuggle a transistor radio into school on opening day. And one year on opening day when he was 10 or 11, he sneaked down to the bathroom, he crawled into the stall, he put in his radio, it was the end of the 9th inning, and his favorite player, Mike Epstein, was coming up to bat. Mike Epstein is his favorite player because my husband's Jewish, and Mike Epstein was the only Jewish player on the Senators. And it's not only opening day, it's not only his favorite player, but the score is tied, and it's the bottom of the 9th, and he's up against one of the great pitchers of the day. I believe it was Catfish Hunter. and the bases are loaded. And my husband, prayed to God and told God that he would be a much better Jew if he would just let Mike Epstein get this hit. Like, I'll be better about going to Hebrew school, I'll learn my Torah portion. Just please, please, please let Mike Epstein get a hit. And Mike Epstein not only got a hit, he hit a home run, grand slam, to carry the Senators to this huge victory on opening day against one of the greatest pitchers in baseball at the time. And he told this story on opening day 2005 when we went to see the Nationals when baseball returned to D.C. And one of his old friends from grade school said, I don't think so. I went to every opening day game. I don't think that ever happened. And sure enough, there was no grand slam. In fact, no home run ever hit by Mike Epstein on opening day. And certainly not at the bottom of the ninth, and certainly not off of Catfish Hunter. And later, it was determined that maybe it was a game in June, and it was midway through, and the score was tied, and Epstein hit a home run for the go-ahead. Right. It was just, the whole story fell apart.
9 out of 10 things in that story
all the
were
great,
wrong.
Yeah. I mean, I think the essential story, which is that he prayed and promised to be a better Jew, and broke that promise within 2 weeks. Within 2 weeks had forgotten. I think all that's true. And I thought, okay, it doesn't really matter. It's not as good a story as it used to be, but it's essentially an honest story about who he was at the time and what mattered to him. I said, but what if, we all have these stories that we tell, and we tell over and over again, and on some level are meant to convey something about us. What if you had one of those stories and you found out as an adult it was wrong? What would that do to you? And that is, in fact, with one exception, the story of every single person in Life Sentences. Every single point of view character has created a myth, either consciously or unconsciously, that gets them through the day. And every character in the story has to confront the fact of the myth. The one character who is not living according to a myth is Tisha from Cassandra's Girlhood, who is extremely down to earth. Remember, she lives in Colombia, now that I think about it. The mother of 2 kids, married to an orthodontist, and very no-nonsense, really self-aware.
And is there to set the record straight.
Yes, with everybody.
Yes,
and
that's her role in the book.
So,
but it's funny because you often have that interaction in the book where someone says, well, it was true when I said it, or I thought it was true at the time, or does that make it true? And there's even the ongoing feud of the grandmother who's so angry at her own son. You tell this story. It's your story to tell.
That's one of those things where I made it up to a great extent, except it is inspired by my in-laws. And there's no story like this. The story in the book is that Cassandra has a grandmother who becomes furious with her son and refuses to speak to him till the day that she dies. And no one has ever known what the son did. And Cassandra has even pressed her grandmother, what did he do? Why won't you speak to him? And she always fobs the question off. He knows what he did, And she finds out from her father, and this is his mother-in-law, not his mother, but she finds out from her father at her grandmother's funeral that in fact she couldn't remember what the son had done, but she remembered that he'd done something. And so she just played this lifelong game where he would come and offer apology after apology, but it never struck her as being the right thing. So she always said, no, I won't forgive you. And that is a pure act of imagination, but I will say it was somewhat influenced by things I'd heard about. There's a saying in my husband's family about his mother's family, and they say, brought up the Hungarian in her, where she went Hungarian on me, and that's when the feuds come up and these really old, petty emotions swim to the surface.
It's a great detail, and each detail retells the story of the whole book. This was true at the time, and what did you know when? And then another thing that you've just said touches off one of my questions. You were saying we were going to a Nationals game and we were having this conversation, and in What the Dead Know, you say at the end, we were going to a Nationals game and we had this conversation.
It's the same day.
Oh my goodness, what a
really,
rich day.
I know, because on the one hand, we were driving to the Nationals game. It's April 2005. We drove past the mall that I know is Wheaton Plaza. I'm not even sure what it's called anymore. And everyone in the car who was of a certain age kind of fell silent for a second and remembered, and somebody even articulated the thought, do you remember what happened there? We all remembered that we knew that when we were kids, two sisters had gone to that mall and never come home. And so, the same day, I'm putting away string and not even realizing it. I'm just listening to my husband tell a story and I'm struck by it. But when I had that moment of remembering the Lion sisters, remembering being in high school here in Columbia and going to the old sub shop in the Wildlife Village and their posters were up there, I thought, wow, what if someone showed up and said, I'm one of these two sisters who's been missing for 30 years, but I can't tell you where I've been and I can't tell you anything else. Just gonna have to take it on faith. And I knew that was a novel. And I always taught, I said, so you have the ball of string novel where you're just gathering things. And then every now and then, if you're lucky, you have that kind of, thunder
meteor,
clap.
the meteor novel.
Here comes the lightning bolt. That's a great moment where you just see, oh, that's a book. I can write that.
Well, let's talk about place. Why not Wheaton Plaza? Why not coming a little bit closer to Washington, D.C. in our neighborhood? Why Baltimore?
Well, Baltimore is what I know, and it's what I feel comfortable with. It's interesting because I write these series books with a character that I'm very much identified with and flattered to be so because I think she's a terrific character. But I grew up in a very peculiar Northwest Baltimore neighborhood. And I've been slowly circling it, getting a little closer to it and availing myself of its peculiarities. I can't even say the word. And I first sort of came to it with What the Dead Know. Although the Bethany family lives on a made-up street. Mm-hmm. But they live about half a mile from the neighborhood I grew up in, which is called Dickeyville, which was built along the banks of the Gwynns Falls near an old mill that had been run by the Dickey family. And I wanted to use my neighborhood. And I also wanted to use, you're writing a book about two little girls who disappear forever. There's a certain found poetry in sending them to Security Square Mall, which is in fact the name of the mall because it's near the Social Security Administration. But I couldn't resist playing with that. I wanted to pull on my own memories of things, just little things. There's a scene early in that book where their mother, who's having an affair with her boss, is in a motel that's really not very far from that mall. And there's vending machines in the room. This is a detail from my childhood. My grandparents sometimes stayed in that room, and it's just such a great detail, and I wanted to use the detail of the vending machines. I wanted to use the topography that I knew. I really knew Security Square Mall. I knew what it smelled like. And, later in the book, when I have the woman who may or may not be one of the Bethany girls go to that mall, I had done that for the book. I drove to the mall.
This was here, and this was here.
And
you could smell this from here.
Yes. And I was, so that's part of it. And actually my next book is set in Montgomery County in part. And there are just a lot of reasons why that works for this book. And I feel almost, a little exposed and out there.
Dude, out of your realm. Well, come to my neighborhood. I want to hear about the Memory Project because in many of your books, you're time traveling. You're staying pretty close to Baltimore, or right in Baltimore, but you're time traveling. And I was looking at the Memory Project. Will you talk about what that is and how that serves you?
The Memory Project is one of the smallest, and yet I think also one of the most civilized blogs on the internet. Like in the Memory Project's existence, there's only ever been one flame war. I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud of the people who participate. It grew out of a writing project that I was always trying to teach to college-age students. And it never worked because it's too long-term, because it's really a project that takes about 20 years to come to fruition, and no one in college is really going to be able to focus on a project that's going to take 20 years. I've kept journals off and on throughout my life. And if I pick one up and look at it, there are two different kinds of entries. There are entries I pick up and I read it. It says, it's Saturday night, I'm alone, I'm depressed, I don't feel good about myself.
Time to write in the journal.
And if I read that section, I can't tell if I'm 15 or 35. It never changes. The emotion doesn't seem, and it doesn't bring anything back. I mean, here's the emotion. I mean, it's the perfect example of telling and not showing. Meanwhile, there were times in my journal that, perhaps most strikingly, I went to Mexico for 3 months in 1989. It's very deliberate in What the Dead Know that Miriam is basically following the same path I followed. And I didn't keep a proper journal most of the time, but I kept a really detailed date book. And I still have that date book. And it will list each week who my teacher was. I was there studying Spanish language for a fellowship for journalists. It'll have my teacher. It'll have who was in class with me that week. And it'll have just like little factual things, just little words. I know that one of the entries in this date book says, "What is grandota?" And it brings back this hilarious, funny story of another friend and I, a woman named Melinda Henneberger. Our teachers would tell us that we were, as tall American women, grandota, but they could never define it. And so the whole story comes back from that one tiny thing. What is grandota? Or
and do you remember it all?
And I remember it all. Or it might say, it might say, beer at Los Vikingos. Los Vikingos, the Vikings, gosh knows why that coffee shop was named that, was sort of a restaurant, diner near the school. And we would sometimes meet there after class. And that entry brings back the moment that, 3 women sat there and talked about one's romantic problems, and we schemed together about what she should do and gave her advice, and that all comes back from that tiny word. So I became convinced that writing about very concrete things conveyed more emotion than writing about emotion, and that you can...
And so vivid from a word, from a phrase.
And so I play with that. People who were reading my website had said, "We want to write. We want a place where we can write and communicate with one another." I didn't want people to write fan fiction. So I said, okay, we're going to do this thing called the Memory Project, and I'll throw out the prompt. So I always get to be kind of in charge, but then it just goes everywhere. And, recently I threw out a prompt about childhood pets. And some of the things people wrote were just so touching and so lovely. This one woman wrote an ode to a pet rat named Molly, which was just beautiful. And so that's where the Memory Project came from. And sort of time and time again, it sort of proves its own hypothesis, which is if you start with something concrete and just sort of get very free and let yourself go, and you don't try to write, but you just let it come in a rush, it's amazing how much will come back.
Well, unfortunately, that brings us to the end of our talk. We've gone on, and I would love to talk more concretely about any of your books. It's been a delight.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you for coming. I'm Mary Kay Zarevlev, and I've been talking with Laura Lippman today. Thanks for joining us on The Writing Life.